July 7, 1968, Harlem. The rain falls like judgment on 125th Street. Inside Abyssinian Baptist Church, 2,000 mourners pack the pews. Outside, another 1,000 stand in the street. The casket costs $12,000, solid mahogany, gold handles, hand-carved angels. But nobody's looking at the casket. They're looking at the flowers, white orchids, imported from Thailand, arranged in the shape of a crown. The price tag? Exactly $100,000. Cash. Delivered in a leather briefcase at 6 a.m. that morning. In today's money, that's $900,000 worth of flowers for a dead man. The person who paid for it stands in the back row. Dark suit, dark glasses, no jewelry, no bodyguards, no reputation, just silence. His name is Frank Lucas, 23 years old. A driver, a shadow, a nobody from North Carolina who carried bags and kept his mouth shut for the most powerful black man in America. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the godfather of Harlem. Dead at 62 from a heart attack at Wells Restaurant. And that, $100,000? It's every dollar Frank has to his name. Most men would take that money and run. Buy a farm down south. Disappear before the wolves carved up Bumpy's empire. The Italian families, Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, they're circling like sharks, waiting for the blood in the water. But Frank Lucas doesn't run. The silent man lives. The loud man dies. Instead, he does the impossible. He spends it all, every single bill. He turns a funeral into a coronation. He sends a message written in the language of pure currency to every hustler, every cop, every mob boss in New York City. That $100,000 wasn't grief money, it wasn't respect money. It was seed capital for a plan so audacious, so terrifyingly efficient, that it would bypass the Italian mafia entirely and create the purest heroin pipeline in American history. Because while everyone else was fighting over Bumpy's scraps, Frank had already figured out how to go direct to the source. Not Little Italy. Not the docks. Not the traditional supply chain that kept black dealers as servants to white bosses. The Golden Triangle. Southeast Asia. A war zone where American soldiers were dying and coffins were flying home unquestioned. That $100,000 came from the first test run. Product so pure, 98% versus the street's pathetic. 10% that it would revolutionize the drug trade and make Frank Lucas invisible rich. But here's what nobody in that church understood. Frank wasn't burying his mentor. He was burying the old way of doing business. Within 3 years, that empty bank account would generate $1 million per day. Within 5 years, Frank would control more heroin than the mafia. Within a decade, he would face the choice that destroys every legend. If you want to see how a country boy stole the American dream and sold it back to the streets by the kilo, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next will change organized crime forever. Frank Lucas steps off the Greyhound bus at Port Authority with $47 in his pocket and his cousin's blood still fresh in his memory. LaGrange, North Carolina, taught him one lesson the hard way. In America, a black man who fights back doesn't get justice. He gets buried. The sheriff called it accidental. Everyone knew it was murder. His mother told him straight, if you stay, you die. If you go, you might live. So he went. Harlem in 1965 isn't just a neighborhood. It's a separate planet with its own gravity, its own laws, and its own king. The streets hum like live wires. Neon signs buzz. Sirens wail in the distance. Hustlers move like peacocks, bright shirts and loud voices, competing for attention like attention equals respect. Frank sees it differently. Attention equals a target. Within a week, he's standing outside the Palm Caf on 125th Street, studying the ecosystem of power. Most men want to be seen. One man doesn't need to be. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Bumpy. 60 years old, moving through the crowd like Moses through water. People part without being told. He doesn't raise his voice, doesn't flash money, doesn't need to. The respect is already there, built over decades, cemented in silence and calculated violence that nobody ever saw coming. Frank makes himself useful the only way a nobody can. He carries bags, he opens doors. He stands in corners and watches and learns. For 6 months, Bumpy doesn't say more than 10 words to him. But Frank understands the test. Silence isn't weakness. Silence is strength. The loud man dies first. The quiet man inherits the earth. Then one night at Wells' restaurant, Frank sees the lesson in action. 2 white soldiers, drunk on leave, recognize Bumpy in his usual booth. One snickers loud enough to be heard, "Hey, ain't that the big-time gangster? Thought he'd be taller." The room goes still. Every pair of eyes cuts to Bumpy. Frank's fists clench. He's ready to jump. To prove himself, to show this king he's got a soldier ready to die for him. Bumpy doesn't move. He folds his newspaper like a judge closing a case file. Looks up slowly. "You boys finish eating?" The soldiers laugh. "Say something disgusting about Harlem, about black people, about power." Frank half rises from his chair. Bumpy raises 2 fingers. Barely. A gesture like shooing a fly. Frank sits back down. Bumpy walks over. Not fast, not slow, just certain. He leans between the 2 men and whispers, something Frank can barely hear, "You're safe tonight because I don't educate trash. But you ever speak my name again, you'll vanish. Not die, vanish. No grave, no story, no memory." You understand the difference? The color drains from their faces. They nod like children caught stealing. Bumpy smiles, pats one on the cheek like a father forgiving a foolish son, and walks back to his table. Frank sees it crystal clear. No yelling, no guns, no broken bottles, just quiet authority. The silent man lives. The loud man dies. That night, Bumpy calls him into the back room of a social club on Lenox Avenue. Just the 2 of them. No witnesses. "Why are you here?" Bumpy asks. "Not in Harlem, not in New York. Here, in my world." Frank doesn't hesitate. "To learn." Bumpy nods once. "Good answer. Wrong answer gets you killed. Right answer gets you educated." The education begins. "The Italians own the docks," Bumpy explains. "They own the supply chain. They own the politicians and half the police force. But they stay rich for one reason. They stay quiet. You see Genovese on magazine covers? You see Gambino throwing money in nightclubs? No. Because the camera is a death sentence. The spotlight is a grave. Frank absorbs it like gospel. He watches Bumpy collect debts with whispers that sound more terrifying than screams. He watches him negotiate with Italian bosses who technically outrank him but somehow always leave having given Bumpy exactly what he wanted. The secret isn't violence. It's the threat of violence delivered so quietly that the other man convinces himself it was his own idea to cooperate. But the streets are changing. A new generation is rising, and they don't understand the old rules. Nicky Barnes. Younger than Frank. Flashier than a Broadway marquee. Hungry for the spotlight that Bumpy avoids like poison. Frank watches Barnes roll into clubs throwing $100 bills like confetti, making sure everyone knows his name. And Frank watches Bumpy watch Barnes, shaking his head with something between pity and prophecy. "That boy's writing his own death certificate," Bumpy murmurs. The feds don't chase ghosts, they chase headlines. Frank's instinct screams at him to compete, to prove himself, to demand respect, but Bumpy holds him on a leash made of wisdom. When Italian crews disrespect Frank outside restaurants, calling him Bumpy's errand boy, Frank's hand moves toward his pistol. Bumpy stops him with 2 words. "Not yet." Later, in private, Bumpy explains the mathematics of revenge. You hit them now, you satisfy your ego. You wait 6 months, you destroy their business. Revenge served cold isn't revenge, it's strategy. Then everything changes on a Tuesday afternoon in October 1967. Wells Restaurant. Bumpy is eating chitlins and talking expansion when his face goes gray. His hand clutches his chest. The fork drops. Frank catches him before he hits the floor, and in that moment the kingdom tilts on its axis. At Harlem Hospital, the doctors deliver the verdict. Months, not years. In the hospital bed, Bumpy looks smaller, mortal, breakable. But his mind is still a fortress. He grabs Frank's arm with surprising strength and pulls him close. Listen carefully. When I die, every hustler in Harlem will fight for my throne. Let them. Don't fight for Harlem. Don't take my place. Go around them. Go to the source. Frank doesn't understand. Bumpy sees the confusion and smiles, tired but certain. You will. When you're ready, you will. The king is dying. The lesson is complete, and Frank Lucas stands at the crossroads between everything he's learned and everything he's about to become. Invisible. July 1968. The funeral is over. The flowers are wilting. Frank Lucas stands in a cramped apartment on 116th Street with exactly $17 in his wallet and the weight of impossible mathematics crushing his chest. Every dealer in Harlem is trapped in the same equation. $4,000 per kilo for heroin that's already been stepped on so many times it barely qualifies as dope. 10% purity. Maybe. Cut it 5 more times just to break even, and you're selling sugar to addicts who know the difference. The Italians own every link in the chain. The docks, the supply, the politicians, the judges. They dictate the terms, and black dealers in Harlem take what they're given like grateful servants. But Bumpy's last words echo in the silence. Go to the source. Frank spreads a world map across his kitchen table, studying it like a battle plan. Most men see geography. Frank sees opportunity. He sees Vietnam, where American boys are dying by the thousands and coming home in aluminum caskets that nobody wants to inspect. He sees the Golden Triangle, where Burma, Laos, and Thailand meet in a jungle paradise of poppy fields and warlords who've been in the opium business since before America was even a dream. The Corsican gangsters in Marseille, the Italian families in New York, they're all just middlemen. Bumpy was right. Why buy from middlemen when you can buy from God? The plan is mathematical suicide. A black man from North Carolina flying into a war zone to negotiate with Asian drug lords who don't speak English and kill strangers for sport. No connections, no backup, no safety net, just hunger and a dead man's riddle. Frank empties what little savings he has, borrows money from his brothers, and buys a one-way ticket to Bangkok. The math is simple. Succeed or die trying. October 1968. Bangkok hits him like a physical assault. The heat wraps around his throat like a wet towel. The streets smell of incense, gasoline, rotting fruit, and something ancient he can't identify. Motorbikes weave through traffic like bullets. Black market traders sell everything from stolen rifles to Vietnamese girls. American soldiers stumble through bars, drunk on cheap whiskey and cheaper heroin. Frank moves through it all like a ghost, watching, learning, calculating. Here, nobody knows Bumpy Johnson. Nobody cares about Harlem. He is truly invisible. For 2 weeks, Frank does nothing but observe. He doesn't ask questions. He doesn't make contacts. He studies the ecosystem. He sees French criminals negotiating with Thai brokers in backroom restaurants. He sees the infrastructure Bumpy had hinted at. Coffins flying home uninspected. Military transports moving constantly between Southeast Asia and America. The highway is already built. Frank just needs access to it. Through a cousin by marriage, Sergeant Leslie Ike Atkinson, stationed at a military base outside Bangkok, Frank gets a name. Luechi Ruby Watt. a Chinese-Thai businessman who controls poppy production in the northern provinces. The meeting happens in a village 6 hours outside Bangkok, accessible only by dirt roads that turn to mud in the monsoon season. Frank arrives in borrowed clothes, carrying nothing but respect and a proposal that could get him killed. The compound is guarded by men with automatic rifles who search him 3 times. No weapons, no wire, no backup. Just a quiet American who bows properly and attempts basic Thai greetings that make the guards smile despite themselves. When Lueci finally emerges, 60 years old, thin as a blade, eyes like black glass, Frank doesn't act like a gangster. He acts like a diplomat. They sit on the floor inside a wooden house built on stilts. No chairs. No tables. A bowl of sticky rice. Tea that burns his throat. Frank waits. For 5 full minutes they sit in silence while Lueci studies this strange black American who came alone into his jungle kingdom. Most Westerners demand immediately, negotiate aggressively, treat Asian suppliers like servants to be exploited. The Italians, the French, the CIA, they all talk big, threaten, act like kings visiting peasants. Frank does something revolutionary. He asks permission. "I come to learn your business," Frank says carefully, each word measured. "Not to take, to partner." Lueci's expression doesn't change, but something shifts in the room. The warlord speaks perfect English, learned from missionaries and perfected through decades of business with European gangsters. "The Corsicans pay $400 per kilo," Lueci says. "They buy 100 kilos at a time. They treat me like a farmer. Why would I trust you?" Frank doesn't oversell, doesn't promise the moon. He tells the truth with the precision of a mathematician. "Because they buy your product and cut it until it's poison. I'll sell it pure and put your name on the streets. Because they're loud and sloppy and this war won't last forever. I'm quiet and careful, and I'll be here long after they're gone. Because you're not a farmer. You're a king. And I know how to treat kings." Lueci stands and walks Frank through the operation. Poppy fields stretching across hillsides like red oceans. Refinement laboratories hidden in the jungle, turning raw opium into heroin so pure it almost glows. 98% purity. Number 4 China white. Frank does the math in his head, and his heart starts racing. At 98% purity, you don't need to cut it 5 times. You can cut it 10 times and still have a product stronger than anything on American streets. The deal is struck. $4,200 per kilo. Just $200 more than the Italians charge for garbage. But this isn't garbage. This is pharmaceutical-grade heroin that will revolutionize the American drug trade. 10 kilos to start. $42,000 investment. $500,000 street value. After cutting. From one trip. But buying the product is only half the equation. Moving it is the other half. Ike has the solution, and it's hiding in plain sight. The U.S. Army moves thousands of tons of cargo every week. Personal effects of rotating soldiers. Furniture. Equipment. And yes, coffins. It's a river of material flowing virtually uninspected from Southeast Asia to American soil. The method is elegant in its simplicity. The heroin gets sewn into false bottoms of furniture and personal belongings of servicemen rotating back to the States. Not in the coffins themselves, that's the Hollywood myth. But alongside the memories of the dead, close enough to tragedy to be invisible. Ike's connections on the military side arrange the transport. $10,000 per shipment. Cash, no questions. November 1968. On a rain-soaked tarmac outside Bangkok, Frank watches 10 kilos of 98% pure heroin disappear into the belly of a C-141 Starlifter. His entire future, his life, his freedom, sits in that cargo hold. If military police check those crates, Frank Lucas dies in a Thai prison. If the product makes it through, Frank Lucas becomes a king. The engines roar. The plane taxis down the runway. Frank's hands shake as he watches his revolution take flight. He's either a genius or a dead man walking. There's no middle ground in this mathematics. As the aircraft disappears into the monsoon clouds, Ike leans close, his voice tight with worry. "Got word from back home, Frank. The Italians know someone's cutting them out. Street supply is drying up. They're asking questions in Harlem, putting pressure on suppliers. They're hunting." Frank watches the plane vanish into the gray sky. The fear is still there, cold in his stomach, but something else lives there too. The realization that he just did the impossible. He didn't just buy drugs, he bought independence, he bought revolution. "Let them hunt," Frank says, his voice barely audible over the fading engines. "They're looking for a gangster. They won't find one." Because Frank Lucas isn't a gangster anymore. He's something the world has never seen before. A CEO of pure mathematics, and the hostile takeover of organized crime has just begun. January 1969. The first shipment hits Harlem streets like a religious revelation. Blue magic. Frank brands it himself, stamps each glassine bag with a blue star to differentiate it from the garbage flooding the market. 98% purity versus the mafia's anemic 30%. The difference isn't just chemical, it's existential. Addicts who've been chasing weak highs for years suddenly feel what heroin is supposed to feel like. Word spreads like wildfire through shooting galleries and street corners. Within 6 weeks, Frank owns Harlem's heroin trade. Within 6 months, he's expanding into Brooklyn, the Bronx, Newark. But here's what separates Frank Lucas from every hustler who came before him. He doesn't celebrate. He doesn't announce his victory. He becomes more invisible as his empire grows larger. The infrastructure is built on blood, not business cards. Frank doesn't hire experienced dealers. He imports his brothers from North Carolina, Huey, Turner, Larry, Shorty, country boys who know nothing about heroin but everything about loyalty, blood over skill, family over talent. The logic is Darwinian. Outsiders talk when pressure comes. Family bleeds in silence. He sets them up in apartments across Harlem and the Bronx, each location processing kilos of blue magic, cutting it precisely to maintain quality while maximizing profit. The math is beautiful. Buy at $4,200 per kilo at 98% purity. Cut it to 50%, still stronger than anything else available, and turn 1 kilo into 2. Street value explodes from $50,000 to $100,000 per kilo. Frank launders the cash through legitimate businesses, car washes in Newark, apartment buildings in Harlem, a chain of dry cleaners. The money flows like water through pipes he's carefully constructed to appear boring, unremarkable, invisible. At peak, the numbers stop feeling real. $1 million a day in revenue. Yet Frank drives a 3,000 Chevrolet and wears 200 suits. He lives in a modest house in Teaneck, New Jersey. No jewelry, no entourage. He looks like a middle manager at an insurance company, not the man moving millions through the streets of New York. Across town, Nicky Barnes does the opposite. Barnes is the walking embodiment of everything Bumpy hated. Custom cars, silk shirts, women dripping off him like jewelry. He throws parties that make the society pages. He's on the cover of the New York Times Magazine with the headline Mr. Untouchable, grinning like a man who thinks fame equals power. Frank reads the article and feels something between disgust and pity. Bumpy's voice echoes in his memory. The camera steals your soul. The spotlight is a grave. Barnes is digging his own with a golden shovel, and every photograph is another foot deeper. But invisibility has a cost that compounds daily. Paranoia becomes Frank's constant companion, whispering in his ear during dinner, during sleep, During the rare moments he allows himself to relax. The bigger the empire, the more isolated he becomes. He trusts no one outside his blood circle. And even that circle feels fragile under the weight of millions. His wife Julie represents the one crack in his armor. She's Puerto Rican, beautiful, completely disconnected from the streets. She wants normalcy, dinners, vacations, a husband who comes home at predictable hours. Frank wants to give her that, desperately. But the empire demands everything, every moment, every calculation, every decision. Then comes March 8, 1971, Madison Square Garden. The fight of the century, Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. Every celebrity, every gangster, every person who matters in New York wants to be there. Frank has ringside seats, but tonight feels different. Tonight the empire is running perfectly. The feds are chasing Barnes and ignoring Frank. Tonight, for just one night, Frank wants the world to know he exists. So Frank Lucas makes the decision that will destroy him. He buys a chinchilla coat, $50,000, floor length, white as snow, with a matching hat. Julie sees the coat and her face goes pale. "Frank, what are you doing?" He kisses her forehead, adjusts the hat, and smiles. "Just one night, baby, just one." At the garden, Frank walks to his ringside seat in that $50,000 coat, and for the first time in his criminal career, people notice him. They turn. They stare. They whisper. 12 rows back, Detective Richie Roberts sits in cheap seats he paid for with his honest cop salary. He's watching the fight when something catches his eye. A black man in a fur coat that costs more than Roberts makes in 2 years. Sitting ringside, calm, confident. Roberts leans to his partner and asks the question that changes everything. Who is that? Nobody knows. No arrest record, no file, no name. Just a ghost in a $50,000 coat. Roberts takes out a small camera and snaps a photo. Frank doesn't notice. He's watching history unfold, unaware that history is watching him too. Frank Lucas broke Bumpy's cardinal rule, and the empire he built in silence will fall in noise. The photograph haunts Detective Richie Roberts for weeks. He pins it to his office wall and stares at it like an unsolvable equation. The man in the chinchilla coat doesn't exist in any database. No arrests, no warrants, no fingerprints on file. A perfect ghost. But ghosts don't sit ringside at the fight of the century wearing $50,000 in fur. Roberts is an anomaly in the nipped, an honest cop in a department drowning in corruption. His fellow officers hate him for it, call him a Boy Scout, exclude him from the real money. But that isolation makes him dangerous. He has nothing to lose and everything to prove. Roberts starts with the coat. Custom tailored. Only 3 furriers in New York work with chinchilla at that price point. He visits each one, shows the photograph, asks questions. The 3rd furrier hesitates just long enough. "I can't tell you names," the old man says carefully. "Client confidentiality." Roberts nods, leaves his card, and waits. 2 days later, the furrier calls, gives him a name, Frank Lucas, an address in Teaneck. And suddenly the ghost has a body. Roberts builds his case the way archaeologists excavate civilizations, layer by layer, artifact by artifact. He traces blue magic through the streets, discovers it's all family, brothers, cousins, North Carolina connections. No outsiders, no weak links. The FBI takes notice. They apply for wiretaps, build surveillance teams, watch Frank's car washes, his apartment buildings, his modest house in New Jersey. The math doesn't add up. Legitimate businesses generating millions? The money is coming from somewhere else. While Roberts closes in from the outside, Frank's empire fractures from within. His cousin Leslie Ike Atkinson, running the Thailand operation, gets greedy, starts skimming product. 2 kilos here, 3 kilos there. Frank discovers the shortage during a routine audit. The quality control reports show 96% instead of 98%. To anyone else, it's a rounding error. To Frank, it's treason. Frank flies to Bangkok personally. The confrontation happens in the same compound where he first met Lueki Rubiwat. Ike sits across from him, sweating despite the air conditioning, knowing what's coming. "Family is everything," Frank says quietly. "That's what Bumpy taught me. Blood over business. But you stole from family. So what are you now?" Ike tries to explain. "Gambling debts. A woman." The usual pathetic reasons men betray kings for pocket change. Frank listens without expression, then delivers the verdict: "You're out. Disappear. If I ever see you again, you're not family anymore." It's mercy disguised as exile. But it creates the first crack in Frank's foundation. Trust becomes a luxury no one can afford. Meanwhile, Nicky Barnes makes the mistake Frank always knew was coming. Facing life in prison, Barnes does what loud men always do when the music stops. He talks, not directly about Frank, but he describes the infrastructure, the Asian connection, the military transport, the family network. He draws a map without marking the destination, and Roberts knows exactly where that map leads. The FBI escalates. Wiretaps on every phone Frank's brothers use. Surveillance teams documenting every meeting. They pressure the weakest links, the cousins, the low-level distributors. Some stay silent. Some crack. Frank feels the walls closing in but refuses to believe it. Pride whispers that silence made him untouchable. But he's learning Bumpy's final lesson too late. Silence doesn't matter when your own people talk. January 28, 1975. 6 a.m. Frank Lucas wakes to the sound of his front door exploding inward. FBI agents flood his Teaneck home like a tactical invasion. Julie screams. Frank doesn't resist. He sits on his bed in his pajamas while agents tear apart his life. They find $584,000 in cash hidden throughout the house, evidence of an empire that generated over $1 million per day at its peak. But here's where the story takes its strangest turn. They don't charge him immediately. Instead, Richie Roberts sits across from Frank in an interrogation room and lays out an offer that violates everything Bumpy Johnson ever taught. "We don't want you," Roberts says. "We want the cops. The detectives who looked the other way, the ones who took your money and let you operate. You testify against them, we'll talk about your sentence." Frank stares at this honest cop, offering him a deal to become a rat. The code of the streets is absolute. But Roberts isn't asking him to betray other criminals. He's asking him to betray the system itself, the corrupt cops who enabled everything. Frank has 72 hours to decide. In his cell, Frank thinks about Bumpy, about silence and invisibility, and the cost of being a legend. The choice isn't between loyalty and betrayal, it's between the legend and the man. And Frank Lucas has 72 hours to decide which one he wants to be. The interrogation room smells of stale coffee and desperation. Frank Lucas sits across from Richie Roberts, and for 71 hours, not 72, his mind races louder than Harlem ever was. The mathematics are brutal. Cooperate and live as a rat. Stay silent and die as a king. Loyalty versus survival. Legend versus man. On hour 71, Frank makes the choice that erases his name from the Book of Honor forever. He calls for Roberts and says 3 words that end one life and begin another: "I'll do it." But Frank Lucas doesn't rat on the streets. He aims higher. For months, he sits in federal courtrooms wearing government-issued suits, pointing at badges instead of corner boys. Corrupt detectives who took envelopes every Friday. Precinct captains who made cases disappear. Judges who dismissed indictments before lunch. His testimony detonates like a nuclear weapon through the night PD. 75 officers are indicted, convicted, or forced to resign in disgrace. It becomes the largest police corruption case in New York City history. Frank burns the system that enabled him, not the people who worked for him. The streets don't see the distinction. To them, a rat is a rat. The name Frank Lucas becomes a curse sprayed on Harlem walls. Frank serves 7 years, gets released in 1981 at 43 years old. The world he returns to doesn't recognize him, and he doesn't recognize it. Crack cocaine has replaced heroin as the drug of choice, bringing a new kind of violence, chaotic, senseless, loud, everything Bumpy taught him not to be. The new generation never heard of blue magic or the quiet way power used to operate. They're flashy, reckless, doomed. Frank tries legitimate business with the same discipline that built his empire. Opens a gas station, it fails. Starts a car service, it fails. Invests in real estate, it fails. The magic that turned $4,000 into millions doesn't translate to a world where you pay taxes and follow rules. The decades pass like a slow-motion fall. Hollywood comes calling, turning his story into a movie that makes him famous again for all the wrong reasons. Denzel Washington wears the chinchilla coat on screen, but Frank watches and shakes his head. They got the coat right, he says in a later interview, his voice raspy with age. But they missed the point. The point wasn't the money. The point was the silence. In his final years, confined to a wheelchair in a modest apartment that looks nothing like the palaces he once owned, Frank returns obsessively to that funeral in 1968. The rain on 125th Street, Bumpy's casket, those 100,000 worth of white orchids arranged like a crown. I spent that money because I thought I was honoring him, Frank confesses to a journalist, his eyes cloudy but sharp with regret. I wanted everyone to know how much I loved the old man. But Bumpy would have hated those flowers. He would have looked at them and said, "Frank, you just bought a ticket to prison. He taught me to stay invisible. And I forgot. That damn coat. That one night at the fight. It cost me everything." Frank Lucas dies in 2019 at 74 years old. Natural causes, no headlines, no funeral with 100,000 worth of flowers. Just a quiet exit for a man who learned that silence is power and spent his life proving that even silence has a price. But here's what survives Frank Lucas. He proved the system could be beaten. He showed that discipline defeats chaos, that silence defeats noise, that going to the source defeats the middlemen. For 5 years, maybe 6, Frank Lucas was untouchable because he followed Bumpy Johnson's lessons with mathematical precision, until vanity whispered louder than wisdom, until one 50,000 coat undid a decade of invisibility. The legend isn't about the rise, every hustler rises. It's about the fall. It's about the moment when discipline breaks and pride takes over. Frank Lucas built an empire by following every rule his mentor taught him. He lost it by breaking just one. So here's the question that haunts every legend, and now it haunts you. If you could have the throne for 10 years, knowing you'd lose everything after, your money, your respect, your name, would you take it? Or would you stay invisible forever? Frank made his choice. He chose to be seen. And for that, he paid the price every legend pays. He became a story instead of a man. The silent man lives. The loud man dies. But the legend never really goes away. It just changes shape, waiting for the next hungry soul who thinks they can beat the odds, even if it costs them everything.